Night workers, what is the most frightening situation you have ever experienced? There is a long driveway near our workshop, and at the end of it is a shed. A naked man was standing motionless about halfway inside it. He just stood there as if frozen. There was no lighting, but he was clearly visible in the moonlight. We couldn't stop laughing when the first shock came. It was just an old man with a little leaky roof who had escaped from the nursing home. I gave him some clothes and called the police. He did it a few more times. I was robbed at gunpoint when I was closing the Taco Bell on the second night. A guy with a gun demanded to open the safe. Of course, we didn't have the combination. Luckily, I convinced him that we couldn't open it, and he ran away with nothing. He hid in a trash can, waiting for someone to take out the trash. And my idiot colleague went in, ignoring the sign warning him not to do so. The really scary thing was that I recognized him. He had worked in our store less than a year ago, and he was a cool dude back then. I desperately hoped he didn't remember my face. I worked in a coffee shop that was open late at the time. I was on shift with another colleague. One of our ambushers, a homeless man, came in obviously on time and sat down at one of the tables in the back of the lobby. He didn't make a scene, so we just let him sit there for a while. It was raining outside, and we didn't want him to get sick. An hour passed, and there was about half an hour left before closing time. So my colleague went to the man to wake him up. A moment later he comes to me and says that we have a problem. Apparently, the drunken homeless man is not waking up, and he's not shaking at all. I did the only thing I could do in this situation. I called the police. The police showed up in a few minutes. They told me that this was quite common for him and that he was their regular customer. They finally managed to pick him up and get him out of the store before we closed. I know, not particularly scary, but for a while we really thought the dude had given up the ghost. I used to be the only one who worked in the night support desk of an IT company. I would come in when the last people left the office and stay there all night by myself. About a month later, I started hearing noises in the office, either on the floor, strange voices, or random guttural sounds, like someone was choking. At first I didn't pay attention to it. The office was old, and old buildings often make strange noises. But then I noticed that when I went out for a snack or to the bathroom and came back, there were lights on that I hadn't turned on or cabinets open that I hadn't touched. I was 100% sure that some killer maniac was just hiding under the table and waiting for the right moment to finish me off. It turned out that one of our managers was in the process of moving. Due to a scheduling clash, he had no place to live, so he moved into his office with the door closed. The squeaks were his attempts to sneak into his office without warning me, and the sounds I heard were snoring. He was embarrassed by this situation, so he waited until I left my workplace to run out and get a drink or snacks from the cabinet. I was working in a factory when I saw a fox slip between the legs of a colleague who was napping in a chair at the time. We have a big problem with rats, so at first I thought it was a fucking huge rat. I was doing maintenance on the hospital, which had to be defended. I got so many calls from their phone operator that I was scared shitless. He was calling because for some reason the intensive care unit was sounding a blue signal, cardiac arrest. The only service still available at the time was an ambulance. Critical patients were stabilized and transferred to another hospital. There were no hospitalized patients, so I answered the standard. I'll look into it, of course, but this system doesn't work. But it wasn't a malfunction. Some guy managed to get into the building even though everything but the emergency room entrance was blocked, and he had a heart attack. I don't know what he was doing there, although I suspect he broke into steel copper. Say what you will, but he was in the perfect place to have a heart attack. They helped me get him to the emergency room, and that was the first and last time I heard from him. The guards never shared with me how he managed to get in. This spring I saw strange lights. My wife and I went to the river in the evening. When we arrived, it was already dark outside. We stopped at the dam to look at the stars, as we always do. In the sky, two very bright lights were shining not far from each other. We could not identify them as part of any constellation. Later we saw a third light. It was just as bright. It was slowly moving toward them, as if forming a triangle. I thought it was two planets and a satellite. Shortly before the moving object aligned with the others, we heard a splash in the river. Probably a fish. We looked down and maybe 2 seconds later looked up again. But all the lights had gone out. It was a little confusing for us, because we were alone. We immediately got in the car and drove home. I worked the night shift at the hospital. At 4 in the morning, I was walking down the corridor and saw a man standing in the half-light, bleeding from his arm and shouting someone's name. It was a patient disoriented after surgery to remove a venous line, who I thought was tied up to avoid further vein removal surgery. His arm was bleeding after the surgery, and the name he was calling out was his wife's name. He was asking her to pick up the kids from school. I was working the night shift at a warehouse that was still under construction and had closed areas where construction was going on. These areas had motion-sensing floodlights, just like the rest of the warehouse. Right next to where I was working, there was a wing that was almost finished, but workers came only during the day, and it was completely closed at night. But there was one thing. These floodlights were constantly on, not one by one or several at once, as when a supervisor walks around or someone checks the sensors. They would go out all at once, then turn off one by one. Sometimes they would go off here and there. Knowing that there is someone else in the warehouse, where there are no other people except you, at 2 in the morning, when you're still not sleepy, is terrible. Even if I subconsciously realized that it was probably a rat. For 2 years, I worked as a night picker at an office depot. Just me and one other guy in a locked store with an alarm system. The only available exit was the emergency exit. The first strange experience we had was strange footsteps in the room. We were in the back of the office, making advertising signs, when we heard footsteps in the corridor. I remember we both stopped and just stared at each other. The footsteps reached the door and stopped. I checked, and there was no one there. This happened at least a dozen times. One day we were working as usual, and at about 2 in the morning the phone rang. My coworker picked up the phone and hung it up in a few seconds. The phone rang again. He answered it and hung up again. The phone rang again. The phone was almost bursting with constant calls. When it became clear that they were not going to stop at the other end of the line, my colleague picked up the phone again. "You have the wrong number. Stop calling here." I became interested in what was happening and asked him what was going on. He replied that it was some girl calling. The phone rang. He picked up the phone and turned on the speaker. "Why are you ignoring me? Why don't you just talk to me?" I tell her, "Ma'am, you have the wrong number. Please come back to the phone." We hang up. It rings again. I say to my colleague, "Man, she must be crazy, right? Just ignore her, and that's it." He answers again. I still get chills when I think about what I heard next. She cries and shouts, "I'm not crazy," and hangs up. She never called again. Since then, we've seen people out of the corner of our eyes a bunch more times, heard different voices, creepy sounds. When I left last month, they hired a new guy to replace me. He lasted only 3 days. I ran into him a few weeks after I returned and asked him what happened. Why did he quit? He said he couldn't stay there any longer. He kept seeing things and hearing voices. Every person who ever worked there at night saw or heard things that they could not explain. I work in a boarding school. Most nights I am alone with 8 residents who sleep well at night. It is usually quiet. But one day I heard a door slam very loudly. I immediately checked all the rooms, and everyone was asleep. It may not sound like much, but all of our residents are wheelchair-bound, so I spent the rest of the night in fear. A few other strange things happened. Canned food fell off the shelf. A clock fell off the wall. The call light in the bathroom went out. I try not to think about it too much. During lunch I was outside, sitting on the ground with my back against the wall. I fell asleep for a few minutes and woke up to a strange sound. There was a bush near me. I was extremely confused, because there was no bush there before. When I finally woke up, I realized that it was not a bush, but a skunk with its tail up. And the strange sound that woke me up was a growl. I took a huge breath and held it, expecting to be gassed by the skunk at any moment. Apparently, the sound of the inhalation scared him, because he quickly flushed. It took some more time for my heartbeat to normalize. Friends, thank you for watching. Leave your scary stories in the comments below the video, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes. See you soon.